Greetings, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're coming from. My name is Leif Lowe, and I'm pleased to welcome you today to our Hybrid and Multi-Cloud Security Summit. This event is brought to you today by Red Hat, Faction, Metallic, TwinGate, and Citrix. I will also be the moderator for the opening session during today's summit. The editorial staff of Virtualization Review and AWS Insider have worked really hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on these subjects for this event, so we hope you enjoy it today. Before we get started and get into these sessions, I just have a few housekeeping items to announce. First of all, I want to let you know that this entire event is being recorded and will be available for future review. You'll receive an email when the replay is available. It typically takes a few days or so. And each of today's 3 sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A session. So we strongly encourage you to submit any questions you have. Type those questions into the submit a question box on the Q&A area of your console, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of each session. And this is some exciting news. During today's 3rd session, we'll be giving away a DJI Air S2 drone. You do have to be present to win, so make sure you stay logged on for the entire event. Finally, we also have a variety of resources from our sponsors available in the Resource Center part of your console. So be sure to download those and check them out. We owe a huge thanks to Red Hat, Faction, Metallic, TwinGate, and Citrix for sponsoring this summit and supporting our community. So we ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Well, as I mentioned, I'll be moderating our first session today. And this opening session is entitled The New Generation of Hybrid Cloud Security Best Practices. Well, as the cloud continues to evolve and enterprise adoption of the cloud continues to increase, more enterprises are choosing the flexibility of hybrid cloud platforms. The combination of public and private clouds presents many storage and organizational options, but can also present a lot of management and security challenges. Fully securing the hybrid cloud infrastructure requires different approaches for the public cloud and for the private cloud. Public cloud provides flexibility and access, while your private clouds can be hardened with more stringent security controls. But during this opening session, we'll be examining several emerging best practices for ensuring the optimal security posture for both the public and private cloud as part of your enterprise hybrid cloud platform. Our featured speaker this morning is John O'Neill Sr. John is the Chief Technologist for AWS Solutions. During his more than 20 years in IT, John has worked as a consultant, architect, executive speaker, and author. He's been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects. He's authored material for a variety of publishers, including Thomson Reuters, Aspitor Books, and Exec Blueprints. He also develops courseware for Pluralsight. John is a frequent speaker at IT events such as TechMinter, Cloud and Virtualization Live, Live 360, the NEOSA CIO Summit, and the Northeast Ohio Technology Summit. He's been honored as a multi-year Microsoft MVP and has also received NEOSA's CIO of the Year Award. I'd also like to point out that he is a PADI-certified IDC staff scuba instructor. Always great to have you back, John.
Always great to be here, Leif. I love diving into these subjects.
Indeed, and we love making diving puns. All right. On that note, let's dive right into our exploration of how to best secure your hybrid and multi-cloud infrastructure against these new and emerging threats. All right, just to start off at a high level, John, what do you see as some of the latest emerging best practices for hybrid cloud security?
So there's a few I'd like to dive into here and mention.
All right.
Some of them are new concepts. Others are kind of a reinvigoration of existing concepts. And so let's start with those. I'm really seeing a push for organizations to, take a strong look at how they're implementing the principle of least privilege. Least privilege isn't a new principle, but a lot of us in the IT industry have been somewhat lax in implementing it, doing things like using domain control or domain admin level accounts on things other than domain controllers. That should never happen because the domain admin account is literally only needed for certain functions on domain controllers. Everything else should be a more restrictive administrative account. That's one example. Others are, applying role-based access control everywhere we can apply it, and not just saying, hey, I'm going to make this person a global admin to my Dynamics 365 environment just because it's the easy way to do it. No, you really need to define the role that they'll be filling and then implement the security rights according to that. So least privilege, seeing a lot of energy around that and being a best practice. Of course, you can find a lot of this guidance in publications from NIST, right? The 800 series documents like 853 and a number of the others have great guidance on how to do some of this hardening of your hybrid cloud platforms. Now, CIS has some great baselines that they provide for hardening your cloud environment and your on-premise environment. The CISA, the U.S. agency, provides lots of documentation. So those are great sources of up-to-date kind of emerging best practices, because that's the fact is today in 2021, we don't have the timeline between when a best practice is actually first proposed and when it becomes a best practice. Our best practices are evolving to match the threats that are out there.
Yep, that makes sense.
And
it's
so
a fluid situation.
Right? And so the best practices are we never would have thought of this, and some people would argue with me that it's kind of an oxymoron, but our best practices have to be agile right now. They have to adapt so that we can stay one step ahead of these threat actors. So another big area is zero trust, understanding that, our assets are everywhere. They're not inside the conventional containment of a network perimeter and that kind of thing. So operating under the principle of zero trust and, a real strong identity management system. I mean, I kind of alluded to that with some of the admin accounts and things like that, but we really need to take control of our credentials, our accounts, and make sure that they are only enabled and configured to access the things that they need to access when they need to access them. And that's particularly important in hybrid scenarios because now, remember, you could have a credential that you think is only good on premise, but it actually provides a pathway for malware or an attacker to backdoor into your tenant and vice versa. So somebody could have a cloud credential or expose a cloud credential and then backdoor their way into your organization because you've got that hybrid connectivity. So it's very important to keep good control of those credentials. And the final thing that I'm going to mention on this slide, because I know we've got a lot of content to get through and we certainly want to have questions at the end. But the last thing I'm going to mention is the concept of what we call a secure fabric. So, and what the secure fabric is it's a identity management domain or a separate identity management structure that is super limited in who can touch it and why, and all of your core infrastructure lives there. So that's where your Hyper-V hosts or your ESXi hosts or those things live. That's it underlies things that protect some of your hosts, whether they be in the cloud or on premise. So it's this separate identity management domain so that if your production domain where all your users and everybody else exists is corrupted, you still can get access to those underlying resources without having to go bare metal.
Yep, that makes sense. All right, well, we're talking about hybrid clouds, which is obviously, a combination of the public cloud platforms and a private cloud. Well, what are some of the primary differences organizations have to take in securing both types?
Well, so a big one that comes to mind here is that private cloud doesn't necessarily make you safer. And a misconception is that, oh, I'm going with a smaller private cloud provider. I'm going with setting my own thing, and that's going to make me safer. Certainly, you may be less of a target, but don't think of targeting the way you used to, because the fact is now we have nation-state sponsored malware. We have nation-state sponsored ransomware. And their goal is the broadest possible attack surface. So, they're not shooting with rifles, they're shooting with shotguns. And so you're liable to get picked up in the mix, whether you're a small, tiny little company in a small, tiny little town or not. Yep. So you need to, even though you're in a private cloud structure, you need to dot those I's and cross those T's as far as the security fundamentals, those baselines we talked about, those best practices, that sort of thing.
No one's immune, that's for sure.
You got it, right? With the public cloud providers, on the other hand, everybody goes, oh, well, they're huge targets, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. Absolutely they are. But they also have the resources and strength to dedicate billions of dollars to fending off the attacks, right? And so it's like to use a military analogy, that the United States military is certainly going to be more targeted than, the military of Azerbaijan or something. But the U.S. military also has far more resources to devote into fending off those attacks. So we need to think of our security and our safety as being akin to that.
Kind of match the security with match the defense with the level of threat, something like that.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And understand that the level of threat isn't measured the same way it was a year ago or 10 years ago, right? Particularly, it's measured very unique to right now. Like, for instance, one of the things that you and I had talked about in a session early this year was the fact that attacks are centering more around holidays in the countries that they're targeting. So U.S. holidays, for instance, that kind of thing. And our little hypothesis there has proven pretty true this year. If you think about the release of some of the attacks with Bellium and some of the others, and how close they were to federal holidays or those kind of things, we've seen that. So if we project that forward, we're coming into a pretty strong holiday season around the world, and so my expectation is we're going to see some uptick and increase in the attacks that are out there. And certainly it's been publicized that there are attacks involved trying to exacerbate the supply chain issues that are going on globally and everything else. And that's really the security landscape we live in right now, is that these attackers are going to take advantage of anything and everything they can to get the broadest possible disruption. Yep.
Sad but true. Well, that kind of segues nicely into the next question, talking about attack vectors. Are the attack vectors different on public cloud platforms versus a private cloud? Are they all kind of intermingled?
Not as much as people would think, right? Because at the end of the day, whether your hybrid environment involves on-prem and private cloud, or on-prem and public cloud, or your on-prem environment has been built on technologies that make it a private cloud environment, depends on whatever your configuration is, but they share commonalities. And one of those commonalities is that they are all connected to the internet, because they have to have global connections. And even if they're not connected, which would be very rare, but even if they're not connected to the public internet in some fashion, they're certainly connected to partner networks and things like that, and those networks may be connected to the internet and that sort of thing. So the attack vectors, as far as like that goes, they're going to be the same, right? They're going to look for openings. They're going to look for, network holes, IPs and ports that they can get into, just like they always have. But now it's broader, because they can look across all your public-facing cloud resources versus just your private firewalls, so to speak. But then they're also going to look for those things that we talked about. Once they find that opening, they need to find some sort of credential to compromise to basically get in, or some piece of insecure code to compromise and that sort of thing. But if you look at the data, by far, your likelihood of being compromised or being breached by a compromised credential far, far, far outweighs your likelihood of being compromised because of insecure code.
Yeah. As you said, once they get their foot in the door, then they can move laterally, within the whole setup.
It.
Yeah. All right. Well, looking at like hybrid clouds and multiple clouds, that just adds to the whole security headache. How can organizations kind of balance and manage their security policies and practices across all these multiple clouds? Whether it'll be a mix of public and private. That's a lot to manage.
So, yeah, and on this one, I'm sorry, I got so many thoughts around this one. I want to see which one I want to throw out there first.
Yeah.
So what I really want to encourage everyone to do is go back to what we talked about earlier, what we mentioned earlier. Go back to those agile security baselines that are being published and being developed by the organizations we talked about, right? NIST, CISA, others. Microsoft publishes security baselines. Amazon publishes security baselines. Use the things that are made available to you to simplify deployment, such as like in the case of Azure, the Azure blueprints. Amazon has very similar type technology. And then you on-prem, you of course have some group policy best practices. Put those things into play to ease your deployment and make deployment faster so that you can be more agile. And really use those baselines to find a common ground for which you can attack, securing both your on-prem and your cloud resources, right? Because the way you secure a cloud or a service, such as, let's say you have a SQL server in-house, the way you secure that, the same concerns and the same things you're securing against would exist for SQL services up in the cloud. The tasks you take to secure them may be a little bit different, but the things you're securing and the reasons you're securing them really won't. And
those
so
remain constant.
Yeah, right. And so when you find common ground, it's easier to attack something. And the final point that I really want to mention on this one is there's a misconception out there that in order to be secure, you have to destroy business satisfaction or business alignment. And the fact is most of us, the whole reason IT exists is to support the organization we're in. So that can't happen, right? Our job as IT professionals is to find a way to ensure that while keeping our assets secure, we're still servicing our organization. We're still business aligning with our organization. So please talk to your users, talk to your business leaders, understand what their concerns and their needs are, explain what you're doing and why security is so important. That communication will help your management strategies beyond tenfold.
And help getting everyone working together toward the same thing, for sure. All right, we touched on this a little bit in the opening question there. But is ensuring comprehensive security more about the technology in place, or is it processes like things like zero trust or least privilege or role-based access, that sort of thing?
So this is a great question that I actually have loads of discussion around, and we've talked about it before. And the fact of the matter is, it's another one of those glass walls that we want to break down because it's process and product. The current processes that are out there, those things we talked about, like zero trust and least privilege, there is no organization I'm aware of that can successfully meet the bar of those processes without relying and deploying modern technologies, right? So when we talk about privileged identity management, technologies, such as, things like Azure PIM, or even homegrown PowerShell scripts that are monitoring for changes to groups like domain admins or that kind of things. Whichever you use, those technologies are what are empowering you to successfully implement privileged identity management. Imagine if you tried to do it without those products and you literally were just, okay, well, I'm going to assign somebody every day to go look at the set of groups and see if any rights have changed, or look at all my user accounts and see if any rights. Yeah, that's never going to happen. So you need those products to support those processes.
Yep. And the other way around, the processes support the products. I would imagine.
That's a great point. Thank you for pointing that out. That's
yeah. Yep, it's a partnership indeed. All right, now looking up at a kind of a higher level, what sort of role does governance play when organizations are kind of managing all these different approaches and different tactics, but also keeping them unified? I know it's another high level question.
Yeah, and this is one that it's like holding hands, right? Your fingers fit with whoever you're holding their hand, whether it be a partner or a child or whatever. It doesn't matter. When you hold hands, there's an interlocking, a fit that occurs there, and governance is part of the security fit. You can't do things in a vacuum and expect them to be successful. And remember, the only reason we're protecting anything is, again, so that IT can serve our organization. Because if we didn't care about that, we'd air gap everything, disconnect it from the internet and everything else, and there you go. But then our systems wouldn't be very functional for our organizations. Governance becomes critical to all these things, and particularly it's more critical today than I think it has been in the past. So a lot of IT security pros are getting called into it and groaning, and I totally empathize with that, because in addition to trying to figure out how to fit security into their already overworked schedules, they're having to fit governance in there.
Right.
But it's important. Things like change control are a perfect way, and as IT pros, we often find ourselves looking at that and groaning and going, great, something to slow us down even more, right, when I don't have enough time to do it. But, things like change control, they're not really centered around slowing us down. They're really centered around making sure that everything we do is successful and every user we serve is well communicated with and never has dissatisfaction because we did something they didn't know about and had unintended consequences, right? And so that's an example of where governance can apply structure and comfort to the users, and structure and success to the process. And, it's also a regulatory requirement for many people, and it's just increasing, particularly with cybersecurity insurances. I mean, I've done a lot of work this past year because cybersecurity insurance is changing super rapidly as far as requirements and that sort of thing. And governance, so the governance requirements that they're coming back with today versus, or let's say next year, because they're developing today for next year, the governance requirements you'll see next year versus 2 years ago, I mean, they don't even look similar.
Yeah, I believe it. Now, do you see like larger companies, larger organizations doing a better job at applying governance in that, or is that pretty much?
How's this for a loaded way to answer that question? I think larger organizations do a better job of making people think they do a better job.
All right, that's a good way to put it.
Right, but it's great that you posed that question because, like that cybersecurity insurance, those increasing income requirements, and the IT audit requirements, those changes are directly targeting what I just said. Right, they're meant to, hey, we have to. We're a for-profit business. An insurance company is a for-profit business, so they can't lose money on this cybersecurity insurance deal. So, what they used to just take. Okay, well, they said they have MFA. They're coming in and they're looking deeper and they're going, yeah, well, you said you had MFA, but our questionnaire says, do you have MFA across all your accounts? You answered yes. You only had MFA across your VPN users, or you only had MFA across your admin account. So we're not going to cover you now because you kind of lied. So that increase is really going against that. I guess the best way to put this is an old Ronald Reagan quote: "Trust but verify."
Okay. Yeah. There you go. That works. And I'm sure that's also a bigger deal, not only in size of companies, but more heavily regulated organizations, like you said, like insurance, financial services, healthcare, and all that. Those are, super regulated industries. I'm sure it plays a bigger role there.
Yeah.
So,
And for us as IT pros, I mean, this is one of the best ways I can put this for myself and my peers is the last thing we want to be is the person that's standing there when the organization comes back and says, you know what, we had an event. You were the one with the keys to lock the doors and close the windows. Why did you not do this thing that insurance said to do, or best practice said to do, and that kind of thing? And I can tell you that in every instance I've been aware of, there are very good reasons, but they won't matter. Someone has to be accountable. And do you want to be the person that's accountable because you had the keys and the control, or do you want to be the person that says, hey, you know what? I locked it down and they didn't get in on my watch. Yeah. Right? Yep. That's my goal is to be the person that when looked at, the organizations I serve can look at me and say, well, it didn't happen on his watch. We pitched a perfect game. Yep. And it's hard.
Don't want to be sitting where the buck stops.
Exactly.
Sure.
Exactly.
All right. Now we certainly know that the whole landscape of cyber threats is as fluid as it gets. It's constantly evolving and growing. Well, what are some of the more pernicious new and emerging threat vectors or categories of cyber threats you're seeing?
Well, so of course, ransomware is the big one over the last 2 years. Yeah. Right. And the way that it works has evolved. So now a lot of the successful ransomware attacks that have been analyzed, they've come back with the data that show that the actual breach existed within the network for 45 days or longer. And the reason that attackers are sitting dormant that long or getting by that long is because, think about it, they want to lock you down and threaten you with complete and utter destruction. And the only way to do that is to compromise your backups, right? And so that's one of the reasons why, like earlier, I mentioned that secure fabric strategy and other things. But so the attacks are emerging to this structure of being able to utterly control the narrative once it launches. And a good friend of mine and a peer, he's doing the next section, I believe. Dave Kawula and I developed kind of a one Monday morning presentation that we covered on this with all the ransomware remediations that we've been involved in over the course of the last couple of years. And it kind of goes through it, but that's a huge one that people need to understand is that, one, you need to have a strategy in place that takes into account if you're ransomed and all your conventional DR systems are compromised. You also need to have a strategy in place that addresses the fact that even if you're able to pay the threat actor, because often you're not. For instance, if the threat actor is on the terrorist watch list in the U.S., you can't pay them because you would be funding terrorism. So You can't buy your ransomware key back, even if that was what you wanted to do. Second, even when you pay them and they send you the key, half the time, the key will get you your data back, but it won't really get you your application. So you're going to have to rebuild those application stacks from scratch.
Yep.
Okay. So there's a lot more that goes into it. Don't think of ransomware as okay, well, worst case scenario, I can pay them and have everything back up and running. No, there is loads of work that has to take place after you get those keys. And if you don't get the keys, there's even more work.
Yeah. And then the philosophical side of it as well. And I get a lump in my throat every time I see a story about ransomware in the news and some organization paying for it. Like, even if you can pay for it, should you? It just sort of propagates ransomware.
It's like that U.S. government longstanding stance of we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? Because once you open that door, you can't control who walks through it.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And so I'm with you. I also, I'm a firm. I get that same lump when I see somebody pay it because I don't know what ramifications that's going to hold. And the other vector or change that I really want to mention is again, I said it earlier, but I'll say it again.
Yep.
We're looking at nation-state sponsored malware. So, it was bad enough when we had large crime syndicates or organizations that were funding this kind of stuff and we had to hold them on. Now we're looking at stuff that's developed by former superpowers or emerging superpowers and things like that.
Yeah.
And so, these are the same governments that the world, expects to step up and deal with global economic crises or climate crises or the current pandemic or whatever. So that's the level of resources they have, and they're spending some of those resources on developing this crap that we have to deal with. And I use that term specifically because a lot of the categories of malware that I'm seeing today, I put in a category that I call crapware.
Yeah.
Because it really serves, it almost serves no purpose other than disruption.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, even because they're not even doing it for money, just to be, malicious.
Yeah.
I always feel like the whole lump in the throat on the ransomware story. I empathize with the company organization that we can pay and get our key back, we'll be fine. I can see the tough spot they're put in, but again, when they do pay, it's just I don't know. It's a tough spot for sure.
Yeah. And there's so much that comes with that, right? What if they pay and then they later found out that is somebody that's on a watch list? And so now they've got to get a legal team and defend against possible, repercussions from that. Or, what if they pay and they're still unable to get their system back up within, reasonable timeline to where they can sustain the financial damage? There's just, what if they pay and they end up in the news and the backlash from their customer base is such that, so you see all these things that come to mind and you're like, wow, this isn't as straightforward as you think. And, last one I'll mention is that a lot of people don't realize this, but cybersecurity insurance doesn't typically pay on the front end. The organization has to spend the money and then submit it for reimbursement kind of thing, right?
Okay. Interesting.
So first off, you better have the money to weather that storm.
Yeah.
Second off, this is where that governance comes in and all those things. Be prepared that when, you go through the kind of reimbursement process, your insurance company is going to take a deep, hard look. And, again, they're a for-profit company. So if they can, as much as the marketing makes you think otherwise, they're going to do their best, in my experience, to not have to pay that claim or not have to pay as much of it as they can avoid paying.
Yep. Indeed.
I don't know anyone that considers insurance companies benevolent organizations.
Yep, that's for sure. Well, they didn't build all those big office buildings in Hardwick, Connecticut for nothing. Now, looking out at the across the landscape, all sorts of companies and organizations, what are some of the biggest mistakes you've seen them make in securing hybrid cloud platforms, and how can other organizations avoid making those same mistakes? Avoiding the big oops, as they say.
Yep. There's a couple I'm going to throw here.
All right.
And the first is what I call credential creep. So they really don't manage. They really don't manage the credentials that they have as they extend their access into the cloud. Okay, your cloud resources are different. They're there for a different reason than your on-prem resources. They're used in different ways. They provide different benefits, and the accounts and credentials that are used to access those systems need to, have specific governance, let's put it that way, over them. So there's great advantages to this. One that comes to the top of my mind is self-service password reset gets super easy with a hybrid environment where you have, password write back and that kind of thing, because now your users can, from any computer with internet access, can handle a forgotten password or that kind of thing. But also challenges occur. So using that same example, like I just said, any user can reset their password from any internet computer. That is something that you have to take into account. So, proper multi-factor implementation is huge to being successful in there. So the big oops here is don't think that as you, extend your hybrid cloud environment or extend to the cloud that, it's just the same thing not in my building. It requires proper consideration when it comes to security. The other is that don't feel that just because you're in the cloud and it's a public cloud and they've got all those billions to spend that I mentioned earlier and everything else, that automatically protects you from all these threats you hear and you don't have to do anything with it. Because just because you're in the cloud doesn't mean you're exempt from ransomware or malware or whatever. So you need to go make sure that you're securing your tenant and your resources. You need to make sure that you're putting in proper defenses, whether it be things like Defender 365, which cover the products that, we used to have Defender for Office 365 and that kind of thing. Those things all exist in that suite now. Making sure that you have things like Azure Defender implemented to protect your on-prem servers in the same way you protect your cloud servers. Those kind of things. Of course, I talk about the Microsoft stack because that's where I spend most of my life. But the same technologies exist in all the other major cloud providers, and that's what's key, right? Is the concept of you need to take definitive action. You need to design strategies. You need to design operations guides. You need to follow those and have them in place.
Sounds good. All right. Well, as always, I'd like to give you a chance to express any final thoughts. Anything you think we might have missed? Anything you want to reemphasize or touch on before we start getting into the Q&A session?
I really do want to emphasize to folks that when you have a hybrid environment, it can offer so much in terms of strategic advantage, ease of administration, ability to do things such as shift from major CapEx to kind of more an OpEx environment and all those things. But it can also offer burden on you as the IT pro and opportunities to the attacker. So, be deliberate. When you move to the cloud and when you extend your presence in the cloud, be deliberate with the decisions you make and your strategy for implementing them and your strategy for communicating them. and that sort of thing. That goes a long way towards security. And the communication thing really put some extra oomph in the training that you're giving your users, because as far as any security practice, whether it be, principles of zero trust or, phishing attacks or anything else, your user provides you the weakest or strongest security link in your chain. And for example, things that, you should be doing are do those simulations. All the major
absolutely.
tenants have some security simulation functionality built in, so you can do things like simulated phishing attacks and that sort of thing. And the great news is that you can often tie those to quick and easy training the user can complete that's already provided for you by your public cloud provider. So, they click the phishing link, which we don't want them to do. They get immediate feedback on that, so they don't have to wait for IT to contact them or whatever. They get immediate training and that sort of thing. But also that activity is logged, so pay attention to repeat offenders. Because repeat offenders, they're either not getting the training that's being provided to them, or they're disregarding it because they just don't think it's a real deal. They don't think that it'll ever happen to them. We still run into those users. That, it works just fine on my home computer. What do I care? Well, I care because, you open the door that let that attacker get in for that 45 days, and then all of a sudden one Monday morning I walk in and I got a ransomware to deal with. So it is the real deal. And then beyond that, think of, let's say, unconventional methods of communicating. Don't send them a Tolstoy-style novel in email of instructions on how to learn some of your different technologies and how to identify attacks and that kind of thing. Maybe use, products like Microsoft Stream or YouTube or that kind of thing to send them quick, few-minute videos that they can just watch that guide them through those concepts and get that training. But the more you invest in training up your users, the more likely they are to let you know quickly when something happens, and they are to avoid it. One of the concepts that I use a lot is a concept that was developed for the military, but it's been applied in legal and business circles. It's called the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, and act. And so it makes perfect sense when you kind of think through what each of those words means. And the concept was to prove out that dogfighting skills were still needed for aerial combat. That that wasn't a past thing. And what really we've learned from that concept of the OODA loop is the person that can go through the OODA loop faster, or the organization that can, always has the upper hand, because your decisions and actions, right? So you're observing, you're orienting, then you're making a decision and you're acting upon it. Those are changing what your opponent, the attacker in this case with cybersecurity, right, what they have to address, right? So they may be halfway through that and they're ready to make a decision, and all of a sudden you've just changed the game because you took an action and closed the network port or shut down a service, right, or broke a VPN tunnel because a user let you know, hey, this weird thing's going on, and you kind of isolated from the rest of the network. Well, now your attacker has to adjust to that, and so they're observing and orienting to that change. And while they're doing that, you are doing the same thing and taking an action. So if you can stay ahead of them by kind of constantly doing that process, that gives you the upper hand. And one of the key strategies to staying ahead of them is effective communication between you and your end users.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that ties into how I always like to think of security. It's got to be consistent and constant. It's never, to use another military term, it's never a fire and forget. It's always like evolving and putting things in place, and requires constant attention, for sure.
Yeah, I love the way you just said that. Like, that's perfect, because our our attackers are doing very much a fire and forget, right? They're just blasting away, boom, 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 unlimited ammunition. But our success in fending them off is always going to be, constant and consistent, right? It's that deliberation, that deliberate effort, because if they fire at us randomly and hit us, and we just fire randomly back, we're much more likely to be affected by their approach than they are ours.
Yep, absolutely.
This isn't a game of Battleship.
No. That's great. All right. Well, thank you as always, John. It's a great overview and summary of how to harden these hybrid and multi-cloud environments. Well, let's see what we got for questions from the audience. And I just want to remind everyone listening in, there is still time to submit a question if you'd like. And we'll get to as many as we can right now. All right, to start off here, we have a comment and then a question from the same gentleman. I agree 100%. He says, better to have insurance and not need it than to need it and not have it. Couldn't agree more.
Amen. Right? And, that's the whole premise around what we do.
Absolutely. And that same gentleman asks, because we're talking about, the multi-cloud and whatnot, so you're saying we should have different credentials for cloud assets and local assets?
That's a great question.
Yeah,
because that means I didn't fully get across what I meant to. So I'm glad he asked that, because there's probably a lot of people that didn't get that. No, in fact, what I'm saying as far as identity management goes in your production areas is get to a root source. So this is a big deal as far as preventing credential creep. Is don't use things like local authentication in your SQL servers or the user and password database that's built into your favorite XYZ application. Because understand the amount of effort and resources that they devote to developing that credential management is way less than the level of effort and resources put into developing, let's say, a credential management like Active Directory, because that's the big one where I've lived in. So when you make your root source Active Directory, and then you make your applications and your resources tie to that as much as possible, as much as you possibly can. And when I say that, that doesn't mean just when the vendor says, hey, you have to run as administrator, or hey, you have to have the SA account. Don't buy that. Push back. Call them out on it. Make them show you why. Right? I always tell people when they're like, oh, it has to run as a local administrator. And I'm like, oh, so it needs access to stop and restart the bit service? And they're like, what's the bit service? And I'm like, so it doesn't need to be an administrator because it doesn't need access to everything. Right? And so you do want one unified credential. Now, I think where the confusion came in is I mentioned our secure fabric. The secure fabric is a separate identity management domain that exists kind of underneath your production domain. So your production domain is where all your live, where the applications are and everything else. Your secure fabric is where your Hyper-V hosts live, where your a strong part of your DR technology lives, and that sort of thing. So if an attacker were, for instance, to lock you out of your standard production credential domain, that doesn't prevent you from doing things like getting into your DR system and restoring a VHDX before the ransomware got there, or working with the host or doing those kind of things. Those functionalities remain intact. And when we talk about a hybrid cloud strategy, it doesn't matter if you've connected your production domain to the cloud, that domain is going to cross, right? You're going to do synchronization. You're going to have that single source that I just talked about. Your underlying secure fabric, usually that fabric is for on-prem stuff, so your Azure Stack HCI hosts and that kind of thing, but it can be extended up into the cloud to protect some of the assets that you may have up there that you're using. So, it's kind of one of those things that is broad and powerful enough that we could spend a whole session, a whole day talking about it. But the real reality, putting it in a nutshell, is separating out some of the most strategic core IT tasks that you need to manage, and isolating them and protecting them. Now, when the final thing on this point that I'll say, because it may have been also a premise for the question, is when we talked about moving laterally through compromised credentials, with cloud resources, so what I want you to have is a single identity management system that is synchronized between your on-prem and your cloud environment, right, throughout your hybrid cloud. But like we talked about, there are SQL servers in your on-prem environment that still have a local authentication option turned on with SA or whatever. Well, just like that on your on-prem, there are services in the cloud that you can provision that you decide to implement a local credential for instead of using that synchronized credential. And those local credentials are actually a threat vector for you. So when it comes down to it, whether it be on-prem, whether it be cloud, whether it be hybrid cloud, the closer you can get to a single source of information, a single root identity management system, the better off you will be.
The better off it is, yeah. That makes good sense. Makes sense. All right, got another great audience question here. Do you believe that small and medium-sized businesses are becoming more of a target? You can kind of wonder if those guys are kind of low-hanging fruit.
That's a great question. Thank you, Edgar, for putting out that question. It's a I do and I don't answer. So it's one of those things that always gets me in trouble with my wife, because there are scenarios where I can say, they're absolutely targeting the easier to penetrate small to mid-sized businesses, because they want to lock them down. And, instead of one huge payday, I can take 100 medium paydays and make more money and make it faster. But on the other hand, and this is where the don't comes in, that doesn't really apply to a lot of the current attacks that we're seeing. Let's talk about the Kaseya attack, because that one was huge, right? And it targeted a lot of managed service providers and that kind of thing. It ended up impacting by far the small and medium company, but it also impacted a number of large companies who had, outsourced some of their functionality to an MSP or that sort of thing. And it affected a lot of pretty good-sized MSPs. So in those scenarios where really it's that scattershot approach, that shotgun versus rifle, it's not targeting the low-hanging fruit. It's just taking advantage of the fact that when you're playing dodgeball and you got people over there, you might aim for the largest person, but I've also seen people just try and throw as many balls as they can as fast as they can, and whatever it hits, it hits. So what I tell people when I use that analogy in IT security, I say our goal is to make our security threat landscape, so our attack vectors, we want to close them off so that we keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, so that we're small enough to hide behind the big guy in the front when we're playing dodgeball and he gets hit and we don't.
Yep. That's a great metaphor. I like it.
Right. Dodgeball is one of those games where being the smallest person helps you out.
Indeed. All right. That's about all the time we have for questions there. Thank you, as always, for your input and explanations, John. It's always a pleasure. And for everyone in the audience, please.
I love it.
All right. Sounds good. And we'll do it again, I'm sure. And to everyone in the audience, please stay tuned. We are going to take a short break right now and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, entitled Top 10 Things You Should Never Do with a Multi-Cloud Architecture. And if you haven't already, now's a good time for you to check out those resources on the Resource Center in your console, provided by Red Hat, Faction, Metallic, Twingate, and Citrix. All right, we will be right back.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course, Red Hat, Action, Metallic, Twingate, and Citrix for underwriting the summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of our summit called Top 10 Things You Should Never Do with a Multi-Cloud Architecture. I'd like to introduce our speaker for this session, Dave Kawula. Dave is a Microsoft MVP with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry. His background includes data communications networks within multi-server environments, and he has led architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet gateways. Dave, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much, David, for having me. And I'd like to throw a shout out to our previous speakers with Leif and Mr. O'Neill Sr. You guys did a great job in the previous session. This slide is actually kind of funny for me, David, because I haven't really changed my background slide in probably like the last 5-6 years, but I like it because at 20 years, I'm beginning to feel a lot younger. So I think I'll keep that one. All right, let's get going. So in today's presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the do's and don'ts, more so specifically focusing on the things not to do with your hybrid and multi-cloud infrastructure. And so I broke this down into 10 topic domains, and there's some subtopics underneath in here. And I really hope that you get a lot of value out of the session today. As always, there's the live Q&A pane. I'm going to try to take some questions during the webinar here. So if you have any questions as I go through this content, I'll be popping in and checking that, and I'll try to leave some time at the end as well to field some questions. So seeing as this is a focus on security for our hybrid and multi-cloud environments, one of the biggest problems that I find customers have is that we're sold a bill of goods from our cloud providers that, hey, it's actually quite easy to go spin up your cloud tenant. You can start leveraging and using all of these advanced features that we're going to provide you in your vendor of your choice's cloud. And all you have to do is just sign up with a credit card and we can get you going today. Well, all of that is true. You can do that. You can sign up for those cloud services with relative ease, probably in a matter of minutes. But one of the things that you have to be aware of, and this is our first don't, is don't assume that your clouds are secured by default. Yes, the cloud providers are being as diligent as possible to try to make sure they're what I'll call somewhat secure. But most of the providers that are out there have advanced security features, but those need to be enabled. In the perspective of Microsoft, because I am a Microsoft MVP going on 10 years now and been in the Microsoft space for a long time, they have a feature inside of there called Azure Security Center. And inside of Azure Security Center, there's some lightweight things that are enabled by default. And those lightweight security settings are some loose vulnerability assessments and, some advice and some guidance for things that you should do. The things that aren't enabled by default is your advanced persistent threat protection. Your ATP agents are not turned on by default because there's an extra uplift charge inside of there. And I hate to get into the pricing game, but, for a few bucks per resource that you have in there, you can enable that advanced security. And one of the things that I feel is that, you're almost crazy in today's day and age to not leverage whatever type of additional robust security that you can to protect your environments. Because the way that I equate this, it's almost like, you're really worried about security. You just bought a brand new car, but, you go park at your favorite grocery store. Are you going to leave your car running with your keys inside? Well, you probably get away with that a couple of times, but eventually you're going to come outside holding your bag of groceries and your car is going to be gone. And kind of the same idea plays true for your cloud as well, where, you can do a lot of things, but, if the additional security is there and available for you, take the low-hanging fruit, as Edgar mentioned in his question, away from the bad guys, away from the threat actors that are out there. Make it harder for them. And so those advanced security settings need to be enabled by default. The cost is absolutely well worth it. And one of the other pieces that I highly recommend organizations go through is invest in some type of outside auditing for your configurations, because one of the things that I've come to learn with cloud computing over the last 10 years is that the pace of change in cloud computing is so fast that it's almost impossible to keep up with everything that's going on. Plus, we're not really in the driver's seat to decide what new features are lit up or what's not lit up. So you kind of only know what you know, and those outside audits that are coming in are going to take and provide you with a level of guidance. And the big piece of it is, from a security perspective, do vulnerability assessments of your cloud tenants. Do vulnerability assessments of your Office 365 configurations, because there could be new holes that have popped up since the last time that you've looked at this, and you need to be very proactive. So that's your tip number one. Okay, tip number two, don't rule out cross-cloud disaster recovery and or cloud for disaster recovery, period. I have a little story about a customer that I dealt with. It was about, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago. I can't remember the exact date, but there was a big hurricane that ended up coming through Houston, Texas. And that hurricane just stalled over the city and just dumped rain, and then they weren't even counting the rain in inches anymore. They were counting the rain in feet. And there was so much flooding and so many things that went on. And I got the phone call from a friend of mine who was an IT professional for this organization. And he was telling me that they have some critical services that are running inside of their office, and their data centers on the main floor in that office, and what can be done. And this was probably 3 hours until impact from the hurricane. I said, well, you're not going to be able to do a whole heck of a lot at this point in time, because we have to replicate your infrastructure and we have to put it somewhere. And he's like, yeah, I know, but we've been waiting for the VPN to get established, and the telco is taking a long time, and and if I have to relate this to something today, our server hardware infrastructure is taking 4 months to actually arrive. Well, that's not really acceptable from a business perspective anymore. So if I had to rewind that whole scenario, I would have immediately suggested, as soon as we had found out that something was happening, let's get some cloud DR going for them. Let's get whatever we can replicated up there, because eventually they're going to lose power and they're going to have some issues. And as it turned out, this particular organization, the best that we were able to do is have somebody go in with a local USB drive, and we copied off as much data as we could. They took that out of the what we'll call the danger area, and then we had to try to figure out how to glue things back together for that organization. And so when we have to think about cloud for DR, don't wait until you're actually in some type of DR event, because it does take time to synchronize your data sets up to the cloud. And this could also play true going across clouds as well. So when we look at replication, we have to stop thinking about, it's my on-prem environment, and then I'm going to connect it to my cloud of my choice, and that's my hybrid connectivity. Now there's actually kind of a third scenario that comes into this where, oh, wow, I've got big cloud vendor number one, and I actually want to be able to replicate over to big cloud vendor number two. And in most cases, this is actually possible, where we can migrate those workloads and we can replicate those workloads cross-cloud. And organizations that are interested in this are ones that are worried about single cloud failures, because we have had instances where the big cloud providers have gone down. We've had identity go down. We've had some of the big data centers take outages. And so in this case, this is what we need to think about. Now, going cross-cloud from a disaster recovery perspective, it does raise the complexity level significantly. but it can be done. So you need to investigate your business requirements to see if this is what you really need. And maybe what is a better choice for you is looking at doing some more regional failures, so failover capabilities. So, maybe in a U.S. perspective, I'm going to take a look at failing over from, East U.S. to West U.S. or something like that. And that will give me some geographical distribution between my environments, because that's available with most of the providers. And they'll probably meet your DR, RTO, and RPO needs that you're going to have. And one of the interesting pieces that I've seen, I've been in the DR space a very long time. And when we go to set up this kind of cross-cloud connectivity or even regional connectivity, the backhaul networks that the clouds have available to them are pretty incredible compared to what we would typically have to work with if we have to pin up a site-to-site VPN, or even trying to pick up something like a Microsoft Express route for a dedicated network connection. That backhaul network and the ingress and egress speeds that we get out of there are actually pretty good. So when we look at the single cloud regional failover, the speeds in there are pretty good. So your failover failback times are probably cut down compared to what you would have with your on-prem hybrid connectivity. And whenever I think about DR, I think about one very important thing. It's not how long does it take for me to get my data from point A to point B. It's how long does it take for me to get my data back after the recovery event has happened, after I've had to press the big red button. How long does it take for me to reseed that and kind of re-glue my infrastructure? Because most organizations are going to want to put things back where they originally came from on the source side. And in that case, how long does it actually take to get there? And from what I've seen from the regional failover capabilities inside of single cloud, they're pretty fast. And even cross-cloud connectivity up there is pretty fast. And I would have to say a number 3 lagging in behind would be a dedicated internet connection, and a number 4 would be some type of a VPN that you'd have pinned up from your data center. So, yeah, I think you actually get better RTO and RPO when you're inside of that pure cloud scenario. Not really a reality for all workloads, but just understand that those options are there, and especially those regional failover capabilities are there for you inside of your single cloud. All right. Number 3 is, depending on the size of your organization, you may not want to take and have all of your application servers or all of your database servers running inside of a single cloud. And this could be a hybrid scenario. So let's think about this in kind of a hybrid scenario where, maybe we're running some Kubernetes clusters for our front-end application workloads or web workloads to run on. We spun up our, SQL or Oracle clusters that are running in behind there, and we're synchronizing those. We've got some type of availability settings to build those clusters and have that data highly available for us cross-cloud. Does this provide us options? Yeah, sure it does. Like we can do these things, but when we look at the parallel applications, the size of organizations that would need to do this are pretty profoundly huge. Like you're talking, if you're a sports fan, this would be an organization like an NFL.com or something like that, where they're taking and trying to stream services, and they want to be always available. They've got the budget to invest in global load balancing services to do this, and they've been playing the multi-data center, multi-location game for a long time. Now it's just a matter of placement of those services. Where are they going to go? The cool thing about doing this in a cloud perspective compared to on-prem, because we used to do exactly the same thing pre-cloud, it's just we would do this in our own co-location facilities. I would pick a handful of co-location facilities. I would have highly connected 5 nines availability at these data centers, and we would take and we would do this ourselves. The amount of time to spin this up for cross-cloud is a lot faster for us. The one thing that we have to be aware of in a cross-cloud configuration with our security aspect in mind is that the native security providers that are inside of there, especially for crossing cloud vendors, we need to make sure that we're still protected with these solutions that we're building. And so for those larger organizations, either span it from your hybrid on-prem infrastructure up to the cloud. You could parallelize those applications, and or taking and looking at going cross-cloud. Both will work. Now, just understand, if you're going to look at doing this, you definitely have an added complexity set from a management perspective. And can you actually achieve this in a single cloud? Do you need to do all of that? You really need to weigh that off, right? Because even in single clouds now, you can do all of these things. They do provide very high levels of availability for you. And so you need to go through an analysis project to see what's there. And one of the big things to look at is just, once again, make sure that you're not forgetting about your security between your environments, because the native security that's provided in your hybrid environment could be different than the native security that's provided inside of Cloud Vendor 1 versus Cloud Vendor 2, and now you're having to manage 3 different security solutions or setups in order to get this done. So definitely a little bit higher complexity, but doable. You can do this, absolutely. All right. So the next one is looking at your development and your production environments. So one of the things that we look at is that sometimes from a development perspective, we like to run our development environments on-prem from a hybrid perspective and then build out in the cloud. And so from a multi-cloud perspective, this is definitely something that I see that's out there. And and this is something that we should take and we should continue to look at, because the ability to take and have, and I'll give you the little scenario that I have around the development environment. I've been in application support with organizations going on pretty much my entire career, so it's a very good understanding of the foundational requirements of, doing code roll-ups between dev, test, pre-prod, and production environments. The manageability between these environments becomes a little bit challenging for us, because we want to make sure that the staging areas are very clean and consistent. And so having the availability to develop in, your on-prem cloud and then just push resources up to the cloud is something that Microsoft has actually really bought into. And where they bought into this is their Azure Stack lineup of products. This lineup of products have edge-based services, and you can have your own hyper-converged infrastructure that's got native ties into the cloud. And so those native ties that are into the cloud are going to give you a similar development experience instead of you having to go rebuild this. So now all of your coding is going to remain the same. The way that you're going to push those applications is going to remain the same. And that makes our life a lot easier. When we take a look at securing those configurations, we can actually have the same security measures that are deployed in that configuration when we're kind of extending that little mini full public cloud infrastructure on-prem. It's a really good use case and a really good scenario for that. So that's a big direction that I'm seeing a lot of the vendors going with right now. And it's something to definitely look at, because then you're in full control and you kind of lower those costs when you own all that infrastructure on-prem. But the nice part about it is that any of the coding, anything you're doing to secure your code, anything that you're doing to roll up your code, your deployment sets that you've got, your automation that you're building to build out those environments, it's all going to be the same. And now that's kind of the utopia, all right? That's utopia. You've invested and you've got this. The reality is, where most businesses are today, is they have a similar setup, but it's not using the extended cloud infrastructure that we can run on-prem. They're basically got their own hybrid cloud infrastructure that they've got, and there can be a little bit of a mismatch between the development and production environments for how code actually gets rolled up. And this has been a reality of life between, managing production environments for years and years, and I've seen it as well. So it's something that you want to look at. You can definitely do this, and you can actually run your development environments in a similar fashion across public cloud as well. So you can run this across public clouds. That'll work pretty fine. And this also becomes very interesting from a hosted virtual desktop infrastructure perspective. Many of the cloud providers are working with a lot of the big vendors. I see that Citrix is one of our great sponsors of this event. And so they've been inside of that virtual desktop infrastructure space, that VDI space, for a long time. And the ability to deploy those types of solutions throughout a variety of clouds, throughout a variety of hypervisors, is really huge for us as well, and developing those solutions along those lines as well. So let's see if we've got any questions. We're getting up to about halfway through. All right. Okay, so the next one here, questions, let's see here. So we've got a question that came through about what do you think about using cloud for reverse proxies only? I actually think this is a good idea. The reverse proxies we actually see a lot. I've got a lot of customers that are doing this right now. Traditional reverse proxies would be used. We used to use these a lot inside of our on-prem IaaS configurations where we're trying to punch data through. Where we're seeing a lot of this right now is mobile devices that are trying to access on-prem infrastructure. Microsoft's actually got one called an Azure App Proxy that can be used specifically for this, and I see it being used a lot by customers to kind of punch holes through to their either cloud-based or on-prem infrastructure, and it works quite well. Absolutely. So I wouldn't necessarily say that you would use it only for reverse proxy, but it is something that you should definitely look at. So great question, Igor. Thank you very much for that. All right, number 5. What about cloud connectivity in your firewalls? Well, when I think about security in any cloud environment, firewalls and that type of layer 3 to layer 7 protection that we're gaining and garnering from those firewalls has been a mainstay for our organizations for years here. And in your organization, you've probably got a favorite firewall vendor of your choice. Now, there are a lot of firewall vendors that are out there. And you've probably invested a lot of time into learning the UI, into learning the console. And one of my really big tips for you, I've been working with a local K through 12 educational institution up here in Canada, and their security team was very well versed with their on-prem firewalls. If you want to talk about an organization that gets hit pretty hard from a cybersecurity perspective, schools, especially K through 12, have to be extremely cautious because kids are smart and they're going to figure out ways to get around whatever we try to put in front of them, and not just from outside threats, but also inside threats. So they were very pleased with their firewall setup they had. They hadn't had any recent breaches and were able to track all traffic, and they were very happy with that. One of the things they weren't very happy with is, and they felt that they were kind of moving back to the Stone Age a little bit compared to their next-gen firewall that they'd invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in for these pairs of big firewalls, was when we look at the kind of default firewalls that you can have that are built into your cloud tenants, it seemed like they were really lacking feature sets and functionality. And so one of the things for number 5 is don't think that you just have to go with whatever the default stock firewalls or network isolation techniques that you have inside of your cloud tenant. A lot of that can actually be ripped and replaced with your favorite vendor. And so what we did with this particular school board was we took that school board and we replaced the cloud firewall with exactly the same model, with the virtual instance, same model firewall vendor. Now the UI was all the same. The management and logging of all the traffic was the same. The forwarding over to their SIEM infrastructure for centralized log management, threat hunting was all the same. It was almost like we took the learning curve of securing our cloud tenant down to next to nothing. And so for number 5 for you, that's a big one for you. For number 5 is inside of number 5 is don't rely on your traditional cloud firewalls. Is there are better options that are out there for you. If you want next-gen protection inside of your cloud tenants, either hybrid, either on inside your public cloud vendor number 1 or number 2, you can actually swap out those firewalls. So that's cool. So that you can do that, and that's kind of a good tip for everyone. One of the other options that we have is, and I see a lot of customers struggling with just the speed that they can get data up to the cloud, is, you know, what are some of the options that we have available for us for either site-to-site based VPNs, and that's traditionally how I see most smaller organizations do things. Can we take one of our sites and maybe configure a Microsoft Express route or something like that for the other cloud providers where we can get dedicated connectivity? A third choice for you is if you already own some co-location space, those cloud vendors probably already have that connectivity there. And it's very easy for us to take and find one of those 5.9 co-location facilities. We can set up dedicated connectivity. And one of the things that I've done, especially if I've got a lot of slow links and I don't have great connectivity from my primary data centers, is for a low cost, you can pick up a half rack at one of these 5.9 facilities, co-location facilities, that have multiple paths out to the internet that are peered by using BGP peering. And so we can get great connectivity up to our cloud tenants that way. You can get dedicated connections in there very easily because they're already provided at most of those facilities. And so there are other options. You can create your own kind of hub-type infrastructure inside of there to manage all of that infrastructure. So that's a big one. Don't just rely on your traditional cloud VPNs. You have the ability to change out those firewalls. And you also have the ability to take and populate routes for your infrastructure. From a Microsoft perspective, they've got some products available for this, like Azure Virtual WAN to help you as well to pin up that infrastructure. And I've seen a lot of organizations use cloud-based solutions like that, especially over the last 24 months with COVID-19 and the rapid requirement to spin up connectivity between our locations. That will definitely enhance your security posture for your cloud environments. All right, the next one that we've got here is don't pay as you go. And I'll say it again. When you go to take and you go to buy something, for example, are you a shopper? Do you like to get a good deal? Do you like to use coupons when you shop? If you do, like most of us do, I'm not ashamed of it. I like to get a good deal. I like to take, and when I go shopping for a car, I see the sticker price. I don't just want to walk up to the car dealership and say, here, take my money. I'm like, hey, what can we do for that? Can we get that price down a little bit? Can we negotiate? And so this is your negotiate slide. This is your reminder that you can negotiate with your cloud vendors. They do have programs in place via enterprise agreements. If you don't want to sign an enterprise agreement, you can consider using things like reserved instances for massive cost savings. And where I'll give you an example is, let's say that you've got a project, and this project says, oh, you know what? I want to migrate 2 accounting workloads, 2 accounting virtual machines up to the cloud. And I'm going to give you 2 techniques to save a whole bunch of money for these accounting VMs. So the first thing that I look at is, okay, what are the hours of operations for the accounting team? Yeah, they work a little late. Sometimes they work till 10 o'clock p.m. They'll normally start at 8. So we'll say that the work shift is, 8 to 10, or even if it's 8 to 8. We'll say that their work shift is from 8 to 8. Well, number one, what are you doing with that VM for the additional 12 hours? If you migrated that up to the cloud, unlike your on-prem infrastructure, that on-prem infrastructure, you basically just CapEx the costs on it, and you're done. And so you leave that thing running, and, power is what it is in your building. Maybe it's included in your lease. Maybe you pay for it.
But in all reality, we don't really turn off those VMs. So number one, when you move to the cloud, consider turning things off and having auto starts on them. So that accounts payable solution that you had up there, if they're not using it, you can actually consider turning it off. And we can have on-demand startup scripts that we can provide to the accounting team where they could just hit a UI saying, oh, just start my instance, and 3 minutes later their app is available for them. That's actually going to provide almost a 50% savings. Not quite, because there's some standby charges, but it's going to provide savings. The second thing is you can actually reserve that instance as well if that thing needs to stay on for the entire period. So if you want to just leave that thing on and you know it's going to be on for the next 36 months and you never want to turn it off except for patch windows or upgrades to the software, prepay it. Don't go into an operational model in the cloud when you're CapExing that anyways. If that thing is going to stay on 24/7, okay, then prepay it. Prepay that thing and you're going to see some profound savings. And so you can get reserved instances for a variety of things, for compute, storage. I think there's some networking options inside of there as well. But don't pay as you go. Prepay. Turn your cloud from an OpEx to a CapEx, because that's traditionally the way that your business is used to running anyways. And you're going to save yourself tons of money. And you can probably, I would feel pretty safe to say that you can probably return between 40 to 50% back to your budget. And that could be the difference of doing another project or not inside of your infrastructure, okay? So that's a really important one for me, because as you're wanting to move up to the cloud, I know cost is always a big concern, and there's ways to take and negotiate inside of there. All right, let's see. All right. So the next one is, from a security perspective, do not take and assume that your cloud stays secure for you, okay? Remember, we talked about this in an earlier slide. One of the things that I recommend to our customers and people that I talk to in this space is move away from your annual audits, please. From a cybersecurity perspective, I think the concept of just doing a yearly audit is very dated. I think you need to move to at least biannual, if not quarterly audits. So you need to make sure that you take and you take care of this big piece, because the threat landscape, like I said, it moves so fast that you have to take and you have to look after this. Especially with hybrid and cross-cloud configurations, there's a variety of comb and intermingled parts inside of there that glue those solutions together. I think that you need to make sure that you're taking a very, very proactive stance on this. I'm a subscribing member to Center for Internet Security, CIS. CIS is one of the big security organizations that's out there that can actually help you secure your infrastructure. Those templates are available for you. It's a subscription basis. You just sign up for it, and that can help you. And they've got templates available for you not only to be able to audit that infrastructure, you can also take and you can also lock it down, because not only do they have the audit, they've got the remediations built into it as well. So if you want to move your environment into a more compliant state, this is a big one for you. Now, when we think about hybrid and cloud infrastructure, remember that there are so many things that glue together your applications now that it's not just an infrastructure as a service VM. There's going to be an identity portion to that. And where does that identity portion come from? Is that identity portion coming from your on-prem Active Directory that you've got a domain controller that's running up in your tenant, and that's what you're providing? Are you connecting that on-prem Active Directory to Azure AD, for example, through AD Connect? And if that's the case, you've got to make sure that you secure and you lock down those identities. There are solutions available to take and put identity management sensors on your on-prem domain controllers. You can take and you can have advanced password settings with that. You can have threat and breach detection with that, and it becomes part of that ATP suite that Microsoft provides and part of their comprehensive security posture. Don't forget to also secure your productivity providers like Office 365, where you're going to be taking and having your hosted online Exchange and SharePoint and Teams and all those other pieces. All of that needs to be secured as well. When you take and you go through that audit, make sure you don't just put it on a shelf. You need to act on it and move forward. That's a really big piece of making sure that you stay protected inside of your modern infrastructure. All right, dovetailing into the previous one, don't start your cloud tenant in an incompliant state, all right? Next finish to spin up a cloud tenant in 5 minutes just because it's easy is not your friend, and it's not a good idea, because there's so many things that you need to look at inside of there to make sure that you're locked down. All of your individual compliancy requirements are going to vary for your organizations because it depends. Are you a governmental organization? Are you a healthcare organization storing patient records? Do you have to have some type of ISO compliance? And the list goes on and on. Well, the good news for this is that from a Microsoft and even Amazon perspective, from a Microsoft perspective, we call them Azure Blueprints. Azure Blueprints are actually free. The resources that you run underneath are not free, but Azure Blueprints are free. So if you wanted to say, oh, well, I'm going to build this new cloud tenant, and I'm actually doing a project right now with a customer in the financial sector, and we're looking at this for spinning up a new tenant. And we don't want to start in an incompliant state. We want all of those knobs dialed, and we want everything secured out of box. And so we can take some of those templates and apply them via Azure Blueprints and start inside of that compliant state. Because the thing that I find, especially from a compliancy standpoint, is it feels like we're always chasing our tail, where we're never able to take and catch up, because something is always changing. And so at least starting in a compliant state, this will be extremely helpful for us in making sure that we've got an active and adaptive security posture moving forward. And it will also ensure that not only your on-prem or hybrid cloud configuration and your public cloud configuration and multi-cloud configurations are all secure, and that they stay secure. Okay, so these tools are out there, they're available, and I like the Azure Blueprints piece because it's actually free of charge for you. Now, this one here is something that I've seen a lot of customers really struggle with lately, is not relying on just, flight time or seat time for operational knowledge. And the big piece here that I find is that the pace of change in the cloud is nearly unsustainable for us to understand all of those features across all of the different product sets, across all of the different cloud providers. I heard a list of changes that were being added on a monthly basis into some of the cloud providers, and it was in the hundreds, if not thousands, of changes that come on a monthly basis, adding services, adding features, adding capabilities, doing all of this stuff. So for us to think that, we are going to take and just rely on some flight time, clicking through a portal or, writing some code and running a deployment and thinking that's going to be consistent and that's going to be good enough, and, we've gotten flight time because we've been able to deploy the environment. For your operational teams, I'm not talking about the experts or the consultants that might come in to help you build this stuff. For our operational teams, one of the things that we rely on is that we rely on as much knowledge as we can possibly ingest to make sure that when the projects team is done and they hand something over to us in the operations team and say, okay, we're done with month 1. Your job is to now take on month 2 through month 59 of the life cycle of this 5-year project. Well, that's where we really figure things out from an operational perspective. And from what I've seen is that too many organizations are implementing these features just because they're becoming available, but they're not following up with the requirements of training. So one of the things you need to do, if you are the manager of an operations team or you're a member of an operations team and you look after your cloud infrastructure, develop a plan with your boss, or if you are the boss, develop a plan with your subordinates to have a 6-month continued education learning plan. The cloud-based courses that are available from these vendors, they're doing a really good job of keeping these up to date and fill those skills gaps on a continued basis. Because if you're not going to do this, you're going to very quickly fall behind with the rate and the pace of change inside of the cloud. And especially from a security perspective, you really want to stay up to date on what type of next-gen security features and options you have inside of all of your cloud environments. The next thing is that production is not a playground. You need to give your team separate tenant levels, separate tenant access so that they can build a lab and they can practice. Do not practice in production. If you accidentally make a mistake and you open up some firewall rules because you didn't understand what you were doing and you let the threat actors in, the responsibility and onus falls completely and solely on the IT and operations team. That is not a mistake that the business made. That is a mistake that IT made. We let the bad guys in. And so you don't want to be the cause of letting the bad guy in. They have so many other ways that they try to get in. Don't just make it easy for them to get in, all right? Build that lab, practice in the lab, and learn what's going on. The last thing is that not, and John mentioned this, John O'Neill Sr. mentioned this in his presentation. The limiting and delegation of admin rights in the clouds is so important. There's privileged identity management options in there to quickly delegate rights and roles required for a help desk versus a sysadmin versus a cloud admin versus a storage admin. We can delegate those rights down very quickly. There's templates available for us. You do not need global admin privileges to do everything. In fact, it's very dangerous because the delete button is there and it's very easy to delete things inside of your tenants. And you want to make sure that you've got proper gates and controls in place to prevent that from happening, okay? So remember, don't rely on operational seat time. And what I mean by that is that operational seat time, we call seat time in my world. I love to ride motorcycles and dirt bikes. And so when I ride a motorcycle or dirt bike, I actually just got a new dirt bike. And my dirt bike that I got was a lot different than the other one that I had. So it's just a matter of getting, that seat time to gain knowledge and learn. Well, if you're driving a vehicle or a motorcycle, that might suffice for you. But when you're managing your cloud infrastructure, it's not going to suffice for you. Okay? So you need training and proper certifications in there and delegation. Okay, the last one that I've got for you is traditional IT roles don't apply to cloud roles. I've seen so many customers struggle with this, and we can put a security spin on this if we want to. But traditional IT saw us having two different types of individuals in IT. We had what I call the jack of all trades, the master of nothing. This was the person that could get into many different systems, and let's say we had a level 1 through 10, was a 2 on a lot of different things, but wasn't a 10 on one thing. So that was kind of this smaller organization, jack of all trades, kind of finds their way around and works through it. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's kind of like that fix-all mechanic that can touch any model of car, right? But what we have right now is the second type, where we've got a larger organization. We've got a dedicated SQL team. We've got a dedicated network team. We've got a dedicated storage team. We've got a dedicated Windows team. We've got a dedicated Linux team. And these are all different silos, different managers, different roles, different responsibilities. Well, when we deal with cloud and we deal with, the different aspects of this, I've seen a very big commingling of these roles and responsibilities. Because let's take, for example, a very simple operation where we have to spin up a new infrastructure as a service, Azure VM, just a virtual machine. Well, what are the tabs that you have to go through and configure on there? Well, first of all, you need to choose the size of the virtual machine. Okay, that's probably my Windows admin. Got to choose, what OS is going to go on there, so Windows or Linux. So we'll say we choose a Windows image from the gallery. Then the next tab says, where do you want to store it? How many drives? Which storage account do you want to have this? And okay, so now I'm kind of dabbling a little bit in storage. And do you want to connect this to a network? What VNet do you want? What subnet? What everything else? So I'm crossing the boundaries of what would traditionally be different roles very quickly inside of the cloud. And so one of the big things that I encourage is cross-team knowledge sharing. Make sure that we take and that we're not siloing off those individual roles inside the cloud. We need to collapse some of those into kind of more consolidated cloud admins. You really have to watch out for some of your danger areas, because just because I can do something in the cloud and it's a couple clicks, it doesn't make me a network expert. It doesn't make me a Windows expert or a Linux expert or a database expert. Those UIs and GUIs make it very easy for us to work our way through, but it doesn't necessarily help us fix underpinning problems when things occur. So what I recommend is that you level up your knowledge inside of your teams, and you have primes and you have secondaries. So if you're the Windows admin on-prem, then you're going to take and you're going to be looking after core Windows functions, and maybe you're secondary on networking. If you're a storage admin, maybe, I don't know, you'll have some fun working with the SQL admin, but make sure that you take and you kind of cross-pollinate those roles inside of your infrastructure. All right, one more slide here, David, and then we're going to take some questions from the crowd. And I want to introduce a brand new concept for everybody, and this brand new concept is something that I call the cascade effect. And this is very true from anything from security to DR to anything. And so what I say is that the smallest changes have the biggest impacts in IT. And what exactly does that mean? Take, for example, and I've had these requests coming through a bunch of my operational teams that I help support, where it's just, I need to create some new, I need this new service, and I need to add an additional virtual hard drive to my on-prem hybrid infrastructure. And my on-prem hybrid infrastructure, it's very easy. I'm just going to add 500 gig hard drive to this particular virtual machine. Well, from a DR perspective, this is interesting because we typically want 3 copies of our data on 2 different mediums and different locations. And so what just happened for that 500 gigs that you added? It seems like, it's a very small change. I just added 500 gigs. But what you didn't understand is that you actually impacted the other team. And so that very small change that you made actually just took and required 1.5 terabytes of required backup storage for your DR team. And so they're scrambling now because you're going and adding hard drives all over the place, and you're not understanding what's going on. And what makes this way worse from a cloud perspective is that storage is actually not an issue. Sizing is really not an issue. Capacity is really not an issue. So if you want to see your costs spiral out of control, keep doing this inside of those environments. And from a security perspective, what does this mean? If we did the exact same scenario in a cascade effect, I'm just going to take and I'm going to, modify this security ACL that I don't really understand on this core switch, and I don't really understand why it was put in, so I'm going to tweak it or modify it, not understanding that you could take down an operational environment. Maybe you're in a manufacturing sector and this just took down an entire plant floor, and you didn't even really understand what that change was. It seemed very small. It was 1 line of code, but it actually took down the shop floor. And so you can just go over and over and over. So having that level of understanding and that cascade effect is what I find it really gets caused by taking and not going through the proper training that we should be. So that goes back to that training slide that we have. And with that, I will hand it over to Mr. David Rammel. David, do we have some more questions coming in from the audience?
We certainly do, Dave. Great job. And let's get to those questions. And of course, we got to start out with David because we both like his first name. Okay, David asks, do you think using a load balancer / reverse proxy instead of a DMZ for Windows servers that require a lot of ports open on the inside firewall side of the DMZ?
So it really depends on the application, David. It's a very good question, and it really depends on the application that you're providing. First question I always ask, does your application require having a reverse proxy? Is that part of the architecture in the build? And if that is the case, then yes, typically we would throw that reverse proxy inside of the DMZ, and we could take and take and punch the holes through. From a load balancing perspective, if we want to take a cloud spin on this, the load balancer is a very interesting one because those are actually an incumbent part of your tenant. So you don't actually have to go spend a ton of extra cash to go get some of those load balancing pieces. And so, yeah, it's a good question. Hopefully I was able to answer that effectively. So, all right, next question, David.
Okay, next question comes from Patrick. He says, to validate cloud security, are there scanners available, much like you can use Tenable to scan a workstation or server for issues?
Oh, what a fantastic question, especially because we're doing a security summit here, Patrick. So the short answer is inline vulnerability assessments are absolutely available for us. Those inline vulnerability assessments from a Microsoft standpoint come from those ones there are going to take and come from those ones there are going to take and come built into Azure Defender. So you just have to turn it on through Azure Security Center, and you actually get inline vulnerability assessments, much like Tenable that you have, but they run all the time. And you can actually extend that down to your on-prem infrastructure via Azure Arc as well. So, yes, very good options available.
Okay. I'd like to remind the audience that we can take reader questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next presentation. We have a couple more minutes, so feel free to send them in. The next one comes from Amarpreet. It says, why not have a tool that seamlessly negotiates the cloud? So we build apps that are cloud agnostic, and the broker manages the negotiations.
Yeah, absolutely. If your development environments are building agnostic solutions that are cloud independent, absolutely. And then basically the identity portion of that and how that's going to negotiate with the cloud kind of becomes a moot point. And it's almost the concept of containerizing those applications. And as long as I've got the same place to host that information, how the application gets deployed or where the application gets deployed actually really doesn't matter all that much. So absolutely fantastic point, Amarpreet.
Okay. Next question reads, it seems like becoming a cloud administrator can be a very challenging role because of all of the knowledge domains required. Is it dangerous to be a jack of all trades and expert in nothing these days? What are your recommendations to further my career?
Great question. And so for this one here, I stepped away from the training game for a few years, David. And I've actually been a Microsoft certified trainer going on 21 years now. And I feel that the updated training that's available from our vendors is actually very good. And what I always recommend for individuals to further their career is you have to be a master of something in IT. You have to take something, and I like to use a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 through 10. Let's take a scale of 1 through 5. You have to pick something that you want to become a 4 or 5 in. And then the rest is secondaries for you. And if you start to get to the point in your career where you can become master of multiple subject domains, that's where you start to head into the kind of invaluable space for your organization. but you have to really focus on something that you enjoy. And if you can do that, that's going to really help you out in your career. So just pick a few things and figure out which ones you like doing and really work towards mastering those individual topics, because to say that, oh, well, I need to be a master of everything is not sustainable. You just have to pick one or two. Those are the ones you're going to roll with, and the rest kind of become your jack of all trades skill sets that you have.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. Thanks again, Dave, for your great presentation and answering those questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me, David, and great luck with the rest of the summits. And thanks to all of our attendees who took the time to tune in today.